Okay, well, thank you, team, for leading us in singing and in worship. I invite you now to take your Bibles, and we're going to be back into the book of Philippians this morning. We're in chapter 2, and verses 14 to 18. I mean, last Sunday was a great blessing, wasn't it, for those of you who were here? We had a wonderful time, and I just want to say thank you to the missions team from the church and to Benji, who were the ones who pulled that program together last Sunday morning, and it was great to have all of you who participated as well. It was fantastic just to be able to worship the Lord, but to celebrate the various cultures that we have in our church. And I've said it before, and I'll say it again, that heaven is a place that is full of every tribe and tongue and people and nation, and it's just like it was like a snapshot of heaven last week, and even today as we gather together, as we come together from all kinds of different backgrounds. But it's a wonderful to be able to worship with all of you here this morning. Well, take your Bibles and hopefully you've turned to Philippians chapter 2. I want to just get straight into it, jump straight into the text this morning and read the passage that we're going to look at. In fact, we're looking at verses 14 to 18, but I just want to jump back to begin in verse 12, just to pick up the context of what we were looking at last time. So Philippians 2 verse 12 says this: "Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you both to will and to work for His good pleasure. Do all things without grumbling and disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent children of God, without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast to the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I may be proud that I did not run in vain or labor in vain. Even if I am being poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrificial offering of your faith, I'm glad and rejoice with you all. Likewise, you also should be glad and rejoice with me." Well, 3 weeks ago we looked at those verses that I first read, verses 12 and 13, where it says in that passage there that we are to work out our salvation with fear and trembling, which simply means that we are to make every effort to be growing in our faith. It's the idea that we are to see with our mind's eye the glory of Jesus Christ. And the way that we do that is that we put ourselves in the way of what I called, or what we sometimes call, channels of grace that help to mature us and help us to grow spiritually. And so what we mean by that is that when we read the Bible or study the Bible or pray, or when we fellowship together like this, or when we face suffering and we respond rightly, all of those things are what we might call channels of grace to help us grow spiritually. And in the midst of all of those things, we want to keep our eyes firmly on Christ and what we learn about Him in the midst of those things. And as we do it, we will grow spiritually. And as we do those things, not only will we be growing spiritually, but the reason why we will be growing spiritually is because God is the one who is actively working in us to cause us to grow spiritually. And now as we come to verses 14 to 18 this morning, we come across some very practical principles that we need to apply, which will also help us to work out our salvation. But before we kind of dive right into this text, let me just remind you of some of the key themes that we've been looking at as we've been going through the book of Philippians. First and foremost, remember the key verse that I've been harping on about is chapter 1, verse 21, where Paul says, "For to me to live is Christ." That is a significant theme in the letter to the Philippians. No matter what our circumstances, we are to live for Christ. And remember, when Paul wrote this letter, he was in prison. Life was not really going that well for him, but he still says we need to live for Christ. And then we've been learning that we need to imitate Christ's humility, and we need to imitate His selflessness. Remember, Jesus humbled Himself. He considered others as more important than Himself. He became a man. He descended from heaven to earth. He became a man. He became the lowest of men, a servant, and even died for us. We need to imitate Christ's humility. And we've also seen the theme of the unity of the church, where it's so important that we keep the harmony and the unity in God's church. And we've also seen the power and the priority of the gospel, and that we are to proclaim it everywhere. Paul was saying that he was locked up in prison, he was locked up in chains, but you can't chain the gospel. The gospel can go out, and its message is powerful, and we need to prioritize it in our lives. And as we think about these themes, and as we actively apply those things into our own life, as we strive for unity in the church, as we share the gospel, as we keep our eyes fixed on Christ, Paul tells us that we will know joy, that we will be joyful, that we will be able to rejoice because of who Christ is and because of what He's doing in our lives. And so as we look at these verses this morning, just keep those themes in the back of your mind, because they're important for us even as we travel through the whole book of Philippians. Now, you might have seen the sermon title that I gave you for this sermon. It might be a little bit misleading in some ways. Stop complaining and start rejoicing. In fact, in some ways that statement is true, because that is based on the two commands that we find in this passage: stop complaining and start rejoicing. It might be better to say this, that the central thought of this passage is that we, as followers of Christ, listen to this, we need to shine our spiritual lights in this dark world. That's what this passage is telling us. So as we work through these verses, I'll just unpack it in hopefully a little simple way here. Basically identifying the problem, mentioning what the solution is, and then we will talk about the process that will help us to fix the problem. Well, the first thing I want us to notice in this passage is what I call the problem. And the problem is simply this: we live in a wicked, dark world. Right there in the middle of verse 15, you'll see how Paul describes the world. This is the kind of context that he and his Christian friends were living in. Right there he says, we are in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation. I think the New American Bible says we live in a crooked and perverse generation. Or if you've got the NIV, it says there we live in a warped and crooked generation. And so Paul takes that description and he applies it to the whole unbelieving world of his day. He calls them crooked. He calls them warped, which literally just means they're perverted, they are corrupt. It's the idea that the people in his unbelieving world in those days, they weren't walking a straight pathway. You could say they lacked integrity. They were morally bankrupt. We might say it today, we might say they're off the rails. That's what Paul is referring to here. And Paul says that they are twisted, which simply means that they are depraved or they are full of sin. They were people who twisted and distorted the truth. And these are the kind of people that like to take God and put him in a box and push him out of the way. This is the kind of world that wants to ignore God or maybe just completely push him out of the picture. In Acts chapter 13, verse 10, Paul, in that account, he confronted a magician whose name was Elymas, because this magician was twisting and he was perverting the truth. And in that context, and in that verse, it says this, Paul says to him, "You son of the devil, you enemy of all righteousness, full of deceit and villainy, will you not stop making crooked the straight paths of the Lord?" So Paul confronts this guy who is making everything crooked. He was corrupt and twisted. And so Paul writes this description of the unbelieving world around him. And to be honest, he probably had in the back of his mind the nation of Israel, thinking of the Old Testament. This particular phrase was often used to speak of the generation of Israelites, especially those ones that were wandering around for 40 years in the wilderness. They were a wayward generation, and they had turned their back on God. Listen to what Moses said of them in Deuteronomy 32, verse 5. Moses says, they, talking about the nation of Israel, they have dealt corruptly with him. They've dealt corruptly with God. They are no longer his children because they are blemished. And listen to what Moses says. He says, they are a crooked and twisted generation. The same description was also used to describe many people who lived during Jesus' time. And in Matthew 17, verse 17, Jesus said this to some of the people of his day. He said, "O faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you?" Jesus said. But to be honest, I can't think of a more apt phrase that even describes our generation today. We too live in the midst of a crooked and a twisted generation. We live in a country where people have, as Romans chapter 1 tells us, where people have intentionally exchanged the truth of God for a lie. Once upon a time, New Zealand was known as a Christian country, but we really can't be called a Christian country anymore. We really are a country that is twisted and that is crooked because there are so many people who are wanting to suppress the truth and they want to ignore God and they want to push God out of the way and completely reject Him. Rebellious and depraved men have tried to push God off of His throne, and they themselves have tried to climb onto the throne to play God, even in our country. And when a country does that, when a nation ignores God, when a nation rejects God, there's always the same kind of consequences that happen. There's the same kind of pattern that takes place in that culture. And Romans 1 verses 18 and following really outlines what happens to a country that rejects God. The passage in Romans says this: when people begin to reject God, they start to worship not the Creator, but they start to worship the creature. Self-worship becomes the dominant religion. People just thinking about themselves, worshiping themselves. And then Romans chapter 1 says that sexual impurity runs rampant in that kind of society. Immorality and adultery is prevalent, and even prostitution is accepted and even legalized. And then Romans 1 goes on and the cycle goes down, and it says if you reject God, then that society will become a homosexual society and a lesbian society, and those kind of relationships will become the norm. And when a country rejects God, Romans 1 tells us that people no longer think logically or rationally about things. That kind of stuff is thrown out the window. Common sense is not very common in that kind of society. When a nation says it's okay to kill unborn babies at any stage in their development, we know that we're living in a twisted and a crooked generation. Likewise, we know we're living in a crooked and twisted generation when our government says things like this. They say we want to improve the state of mental health in our country and we want to reduce the suicide rates in our country, and those things are absolutely fine. We should want to do that. Yet at the same time, they're pushing to legalize a drug which is known to increase mental health problems. And they're pushing, some of them anyway, to give the elderly or anyone with a long-term disability the freedom to end their own life. That is illogical and irrational thinking, the very thinking that Romans 1 reminds us and teaches us about. There is a lot of foolish, depraved thinking going on in our world, not only in New Zealand, but around the world. And so Romans 1 verses 18 to 32 give an accurate description really of what's happening even in our country. And right at the end of that chapter in verse 32, it says that not only do people make those ridiculous kind of decisions and choices that are irrational and illogical, it says that there's also a grandstand full of people, full of foolish people who are cheering them on, telling them to do it. We might call them the loud liberals who are doing that, or maybe even the lousy left, whatever you want to call them, but there's a lot of people egging them on. We live in a crooked and a twisted generation. Our world is a dark, dark place. It's depraved, it's lost, it's perverse, it's wicked. We understand that. That is a problem. In fact, that is the problem. So, okay, we know what the problem is. The question is, what should we do about it? I mean, it's always good to identify a problem. We should do that, but don't just identify a problem. It's even better to find a solution for it. And so the second thing that we want to see in this passage is the solution. And the solution is simply this, and that is that we ought to shine as lights in the world. Verse 15 there goes on to say, among whom you, talking to Christians, you are to shine as lights in the world. So as Christians, we are called to light up this world by standing out like a star does in the night sky. So in some ways, we don't want to be too disheartened about the problem of our world and the darkness and the darker it's getting, because oftentimes the darker a world gets, the easier it is to see the light. And so we have a real opportunity, a wonderful opportunity to make a difference in our culture. We are to shine as lights in the world. This is the very thing that Jesus himself taught in the Sermon on the Mount. Remember that in Matthew 5, verses 14 to 16, Jesus says to his followers, to Christians, he says, you are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, Jesus says to his listeners in that occasion, but also to us today, Jesus says, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. So Paul is really just echoing the words of Jesus here in Philippians 2. We are to shine as lights. We ought to stand out in our world, just as stars stand out in a dark sky, or just as a city up on a hill cannot be hidden. That's what we need to be as believers. And maybe if you look through your newsletter earlier today, you'll notice that we put the purpose statement, our OBC purpose statement in there, because that purpose statement that we have as a church is derived from Philippians chapter 2, verse 15, and even the verses that we read there in Matthew chapter 5. In fact, on our banner over here, I don't know if you've ever read it or looked at it, but if you notice on there, the two verses are the ones that I've just referred to in this message. Our purpose is to be lights in this dark world. That's why we call our sports camp team the OBC Light. Kind of follows our purpose statement, but a great reminder that that's what we are to do. And not only are we to shine our light, the word light we've turned into an acronym, as you can see, and it reminds us of other things that we need to do as a church. The purpose of the church is to be loving. It's to be imparting the gospel. It is to be glorifying God. It is to be hoping as we look to the future, and it is to be teaching. That reminds us of what we are to do as a church. So as Christians, we're to stand out in the world. We are to make a difference. Remember that the world is watching us. The world might be a dark place, but you know what? The world is still watching us. You call yourself a Christian, they're going to look at you. Their eyes are going to observe the way that you live. Their ears are going to listen to your conversations. And in many ways, they are measuring and even evaluating the brightness of your light. And it's a sad reality that many Christians don't have a lot of illumination in their light, which is obviously not a good advertisement for Christianity. We need to have bright lights. And so the question is, how do we shine our lights brighter? We know we're supposed to be shining our lights. How do we make our lights brighter? How do we get that maximum illumination from our lights? Well, that's the third main point we want to look at this morning. We'll spend the rest of the time looking at this. The question is, how do we shine as lights? How do we do that? What is the process? What is the method? How do we increase the illumination? And so in this passage, I've identified 5 practical ways that we can think through and apply to our own lives so that we can brighten our light, so that we will be a greater testimony in our dark world. This is not an exhaustive list, but it's just some things that we pull out of these verses. Let's have a look at these things. This is how to shine brighter. The first thing is this: stop complaining. If you are a believer, Paul says, do all things without grumbling or disputing. Notice that the verse is all-inclusive here. He says, do all things without grumbling. I'm guessing for most of us, it's pretty easy to travel through our day or travel through life, and in most situations we can respond okay, but then there are times when we have those lapses. Something happens and we start complaining. We start talking negatively. But Paul says that's not even an option for us. Paul says that if you're a Christian, there needs to be zero complaining. That's the standard. There's no room for grumbling, no room for complaining. You might think about that and say, well, Phil, does that mean that I am not allowed to complain if I'm at a cafe and I get a cup of coffee and it's got a fly in it? Can I complain about that? Or if I'm at a restaurant and I'm eating this juicy steak and there's a hair that's stuck in it, can I complain about that? Well, the answer to that question is, well, it depends on how you respond. It would certainly be wrong if you're in that context in the restaurant and you went up to the chef and you let rip with a tirade of abuse. However, if you went and you pointed out graciously and in a friendly manner, what you found in your meal, then that would obviously be okay. That's not a complaint. They actually want to know that that's happened to you and they want to fix it. But the idea of grumbling here is it's complaining with a negative attitude or a bad attitude. That's the kind of thing that we need to avoid. I mean, grumbling and complaining is essentially, it's a hostile, emotionally charged response because, listen to this, because you didn't get what you wanted, or you didn't get what you thought you deserved. The grumbling and complaining you must avoid is those times when you get a little bit upset because you didn't get your own way. You don't complain and grumble. You can't let rip if you don't get your own way with unkind, unloving, and perhaps even slanderous words. Kids often find it easy to complain, don't they? But so do older kids. Did you notice that? The ones who are in their 30s and 40s and 50s and even older. Complaining comes naturally to many people. But Paul says here, we're not to complain. We're to stop complaining or stop disputing. We ought not to do it. We need to guard our tongues because words are weapons, and if we use them wrongly, they can cause great harm. We ought not to complain. You might ask the question, well, what's so wrong with complaining? Well, when we grumble or when we complain or when we dispute, we are usually complaining against God and His sovereignty and His providential activity in your life. When we complain, we are essentially saying this: God, we think that you're doing a poor job letting this terrible thing, whatever it is, happen to me. It's true, isn't it, in life, that God will often put some pretty difficult people in our way. He will put some huge problems into our life. He will allow us to go through some tough trials. But our response is not to grumble, it's not to complain, but it is to react biblically. It is to react graciously. It is to react, this is how we should react. We react trusting in God in those times and in those moments. Sadly, some people are so good at complaining that it just becomes a natural, sinful habit that becomes hard to break. They complain about everything. They complain about the weather, the neighbor's dog, squeezing the toothpaste the wrong way, the expressway traffic, the room temperature, whatever. They find anything and they complain about it. Well, Paul is saying to us, don't become like that. And it was really great to hear what Dave said this morning. He made the comment, do you remember? That the people in the Solomon Islands, they don't complain. Isn't it interesting that oftentimes the people who have the least material stuff in this world do the least complaining, and the people who have more do more complaining? That's a sad reality. So as a church, we must do all things without grumbling and complaining. Why? Because grumbling and complaining not only is a threat against God in a sense, but it threatens church unity. It creates at times confusion, and it can create division in churches. And it is a sad reality that some churches are full of people who complain. They're just not happy about so many things. Complaining always occurs when people don't get their own way. And so they kick up a fuss. But as Christians, we must not do that. Instead, we need to develop, this is what we need to do to overcome this. We need to develop a trust in God, that He's in control, that He often brings about sovereign circumstances in our life, even if we don't like them. But not only that, we need to develop a trust in those who are in authority in our lives. Whether it be a parent, whether it be a teacher, whether it be leaders in the church, whether it be even leaders in our society. So we need to trust. We need to remember that those interruptions that come into our daily lifestyle, that they are really in many ways divine interruptions. So we need to accept them that way. Trust that God is using them to mold us and He's using them for our good and for His glory. And so we don't want to grumble about them. Now, it is true to say that the Bible is full of complainers. Did you know that? Not for us to imitate, but as warnings for us. I mean, the very beginning of the Bible, Adam was a complainer. He was the first complainer. He blamed Eve for his sin and he complained to God. The nation of Israel, as I mentioned before, grumbled and complained all of the time. Well, most of the time. Even though God had miraculously delivered them from Egypt out of slavery, He had provided for them, He had protected them, they still complained that they didn't have enough food and water. They didn't trust God. Even when the Israelites, remember when they were planning to go into the promised land and the 12 spies went in and then they came back and 10 of them came back with a bad report. They were complaining, saying, we can't go in, we can't do it, it's too tough, the people are too big, we're not going to trust God in this. But thankfully 2 guys came back and said, yeah, we can trust God. 1 Corinthians 10, verses 9 and 10, Paul is talking about that particular generation of faithless Israelites, and he issues a warning to us. He says this, we must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents. And then Paul says, nor grumble, as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. God doesn't like it when we grumble. In fact, He took it very seriously, and people lost their lives for grumbling in the Old Testament. And when we do complain, when we do grumble, and even argue in the context of the church, it's a terrible advertisement to a watching world. And that's why later on in the book of Philippians, Paul is going to address those 2 ladies that we've mentioned, Euodia and Syntyche, because they were up in arms with each other. They were arguing with each other, disputing with each other, complaining to each other about whatever, we don't know. But it was a terrible testimony to a watching world, and it was terrible for the unity of the church. Jesus says in John 13:35, by this all people will know that you are my disciples. How? When you complain to one another? When you dispute with one another? No, when you love one another. So love in the church is key, not grumbling, not complaining. And if we follow Paul's counsel here, when there is no complaining, no grumbling, no arguing, then our spiritual lights will be shining a little brighter. That's one practical way that we can shine our lights brighter. Another practical way, a second way in this passage is that we are to live above reproach. Live above reproach. Look at verse 15. Paul says there, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God, without blemish. This is really the standard that God calls all Christians to, that particular verse there. That we are to be blameless and innocent and without blemish. And you can sum that up by literally saying we are to be above reproach. We understand that, don't we? I mean, the Bible says time and time again that we are to live holy as God is holy. We are to pursue righteousness. Jesus tells us in the Sermon on the Mount, He says, you are to be perfect, even as your heavenly Father is perfect. Now we understand we will never be able to obtain sinless perfection while we're here on earth, but we need to aim for that standard. We ought to be aiming for holiness and righteousness and perfection. And when we do that, our lives will be different. And they will be great testimony to a watching world. We're certainly not perfect, we understand that, but we do need to strive for perfection. And so there is this call that goes out, even in this passage, to every one of us who claims to be a Christian, that we are to live above reproach. We are to be law-abiding citizens. We are to uphold Christian principles with love and with grace. And we are to work out our salvation. And as we do that, we are called to a higher standard of morality. That is God's standard for us. And the good news is this, back in verse 13, remember, God is the one helping us to do that. We can't do it in our own strength. We need His strength to help us. Yes, we need to put in the effort. We need to work hard. We need to put off those sins that we ought not to have on and put on righteous living. But underneath all of that, God is helping us and working to make us more like Christ. When an unbeliever looks at your life, can they tell that there's something different? Can they tell that you have a transformed life? Or do you look no different than anybody else? Peter talks about this very issue in 1 Peter 2, verses 9 to 12. He reminds us that the world is watching us. The unbelieving world is looking at us. And he reminds his readers in those verses, he says, "But you are a chosen race. You're a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for His own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of Him who called you out of darkness," we're out of the world, out of darkness, "into His marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy." And then he goes on, he says, "Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable." In other words, live above reproach, he's saying. Why? "So that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation." In other words, Peter is saying, live your life to such a high standard, ethically and morally, that when an unbelieving world looks at your life, they know there's something different about you and they're attracted to it. And they want to find out more about it. And they want to find out why your life is so different, that you're not wallowing around in all these sins day after day after day. So the question is, do you stand out in this world? Are you like a star in a dark sky? Are you a Christian shining his or her lights? Living above reproach is a fantastic testimony to a watching world of unbelievers. Let me give you another third practical way that we can shine our light a little brighter. And that is that we are to hold forth the message of light. Hold forth the message of light. Look at verse 16. Paul says, "Holding fast to the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I may be proud that I did not run in vain or labor in vain." When Paul speaks here of holding fast to the word of life, you could translate that like holding forth the word of life. It's the idea here that Christians and the church are called to hold out the word of life. I mean, it's a great little phrase, that word of life. There's obviously a ministry in New Zealand and around the world called Word of Life, which they take their name from this verse. But word of life in this verse means God's message of hope and life. It's the gospel message, essentially. It's the good news that Jesus Christ saves sinners, transforms their lives. He calls them out of darkness and He calls them into His wonderful light. And so it is this particular word of life that gives hope to our twisted and our crooked generation. So your spiritual light will shine much brighter when you take the word of life, that is the gospel, and you share it with an unbelieving world. That is a great way to shine your light, by sharing the gospel. And as the Apostle Paul writes these verses, he's even thinking about the future. Remember, Paul's standing really in many ways on death row. He doesn't know whether he's about to be released from prison or whether he's about to be killed for being where he is. And as he looks forward to that future day here, he talks about the day of Christ. He looks forward to that time when Christ is going to come, when he's going to return, and God is going to hand out rewards to all of his people, to all of his followers, and he's going to hand out rewards for how they've lived. And Paul is thinking about that, and he's hoping that the Christians in Philippi will be able to stand before God on that day, and that God will be able to say to them, "Well done, good and faithful servants." And if that happens, Paul will be pleased. He will be pleased because all of the suffering and all of the pain that he's faced in this world would be well worth it. That's what Paul is saying in this verse. He will be delighted to know that his Christian friends are likewise shining their spiritual lights in their dark world there in Philippi. But that's our responsibility as well, not just them. This is how we shine as stars in our world, by offering the word of life to a dark and a dying world. So going back to some of those things I said earlier in New Zealand, mothers who want to abort their babies, they need a voice for life, but they really need the word of life. They need the good news. They need the hope that only Jesus Christ provides. All those people who want to go and smoke cannabis because they think it's going to enhance their world or enhance their life, they too need the word of life. Because as one of my buddies once said, he's a converted drug user. He's a Christian now. He said, "There ain't no high like the Most High." You like that? If you get it. Elderly people who want to prematurely end their earthly life, they need the word of life. Because death is not the end of the story. We don't want to let people take their life if they haven't wrestled with the word of life. God is the one who gives life, and God is the one who takes life. Man does not have the ability to do that. Well, he does it, but he ought not to do it. God's in control of that. He's in charge of that. The gospel offers hope. The word of life offers hope to the sick and to the suffering and to the hurting. Young people who are feeling depressed and struggling to find their place in this world and are toying with the idea of ending it all, they too need hope. They need a faithful Christian who can come along and offer them the word of life, the word of hope that they so desperately need. So the question is, who's going to hold out the word of life? Who's going to hold it forth? Well, we need to do it. We all must do it. Paul urges us to do that. We need to do it. And when we do it, we are shining our lights a little brighter. Let me give you a fourth thing that Paul identifies in this passage in verse 17. It's really just simply that we need to live sacrificially. If you want to shine your light, live sacrificially. Paul did. The Philippians did. Verse 17, Paul says, "Even if I am being poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrificial offering of your faith, I'm glad and rejoice with you all." I mean, as I said, Paul is anticipating his death. He knows he's possibly about to die, but he really didn't care. He was willing to sacrifice his own life for the sake of others. He personally endured suffering for the benefit of others. And so he refers to his life here as like a drink offering. It's a drink offering was a familiar practice to both Jew and Gentile in that culture. When an animal had been sacrificed and it was being burned on the altar, they would often pour a drink offering onto it. It would either be wine or maybe olive oil was poured out upon that offering. And Paul is comparing his life to that particular drink offering, and he's really just saying, I'm pouring out my life for your sake. I will sacrifice everything for your sake. He knew at any minute he could die as a martyr, and it was a very real possibility to him. But Paul says, I will die a happy man if my spiritual children are living faithful lives. Paul lived a sacrificial life, and even the Philippians were sacrificial in the way that they lived. They helped each other. They even helped Paul. And all of that made Paul glad and caused him to rejoice no matter what happens. And so the point is simply this. We need to live sacrificial lives, thinking of others, looking out for others, helping others to grow in their faith, serving others. And so we need to imitate Paul in that regard and imitate Christ in that regard and even imitate the Philippians who were doing that. They were serving others, sacrificing to others. One more thing to think about in this passage. If you want your light to shine a little brighter, start rejoicing. Verse 18, likewise Paul says to the Philippians, you, and he says to us, you also should be glad and rejoice with me. Do you know what's attractive to a dark world? A joyful Christian. A joyful Christian no matter what they are facing in life. Paul was going through some horrific stuff in his life. I know lots of Christians who have been through some horrific stuff and they've said to me, you know what? I'm still rejoicing in the Lord. I still have that joy in my heart even though I'm facing something really tough. That's a huge testimony to a watching, unbelieving world. Paul was a great example of one who rejoiced in the midst of suffering. And we too need to do the same. And we can do that. Number one, you have to be a Christian, though. You have to be able to follow. You want to be a follower of Christ and follow Him because it's only possible when that's true of you. But you also need to live for Christ. You need to have that humility that only Christ can give you. You need to have that others mindset. When you're thinking about yourself, you'll never be joyful. I guarantee it. If you want to know true joy, it comes from serving Christ and serving other people. It doesn't come from serving yourself. It never does. And so Paul urges the Philippians here to be glad and to be joyful, and he's given them some ways that they can do that. And he's given us the same truths as well. So may we follow his example. Help us to be brighter lights. And we can do that by not complaining, by striving for godliness, by holding out the word of hope, by serving sacrificially. We do all those things, we'll have a rejoicing heart, and we will be a great testimony to a watching world. May God help us to do that and to live that kind of way, because that's the greatest way to live. Well, let's bow our heads and pray for that. The team's going to come up and we'll finish with a song. Trust and Obey, I think we're going to sing. So, Father, thank you for just the reminders again from this passage. And, Lord, some practical teaching in this passage for us to embrace and not only think about, Lord, but to go out and put into practice. And so, Lord, give us the strength, give us the faithfulness to be able to live these truths out in our life every day. Help us, Lord, to be shining those lights the way that you want us to. Help us, Lord, to be responding rightly to difficult circumstances, not complaining and grumbling, Lord, but trusting you every step of the way.